the world economy would grind to a catastrophic halt. In the 20th century, wars have been waged over fossil fuels. What if we were to learn that there exists a new form of clean energy in virtually unlimited supply? A renewable resource, legitimized in hundreds of laboratory tests and peer-reviewed scientific journals, but which is ignored by governments and censored by many prestigious publications.
Water. Its urgent rush to shore has chiseled craggy cliffs from solid stone. It is home to the great animals of the sea and is the stuff of which 60% of the human body is composed. Over 2/3 of our world's surface is covered with this life-sustaining substance. Yet to this day, many aspects of water remain a mystery. Over a century ago, visionary novelist Jules Verne wrote, "I believe that water will one day be employed as a fuel, that hydrogen and oxygen which constitute it, used singly or together, will furnish an inexhaustible source of heat and light." On March 23, 1989, Jules Verne's prophecy of a world powered by water rose upon the landscape of popular culture. Two distinguished chemists, Dr. Martin Fleischmann and Dr. Stanley Pons, announced to the amazement of the world that they had detected a nuclear-like reaction that could turn water into a powerful new fuel. Their discovery became known as cold fusion because, they said, it delivered fusion energy like that produced in the sun without emitting deadly radiation.
We didn't call it cold fusion at all. That was a term which was wished on us, but we never called it that. We felt the processes had to be nuclear to account for the high levels of the energy.
In answer to their claim, the Department of Energy quickly assembled a review panel headed up by Dr. John Huizenga.
We wrote a very negative report and concluded that the results that were being presented to us were contrary to everything we had found out about nuclear physics over the last 50 years.
The sword of this panel's condemnation struck with speed and brutality, ignoring the facts in a blind rush to judgment.
Hot fusion physics people have been very vigorous in their denunciation of this being called fusion.
Right away, reports came in of excess heat, much too large to be from any chemical reaction. Laboratories from Texas to India confirmed the presence of tritium, a vital determining feature of a nuclear reaction.
Within 2 or 3 weeks, we got the first results, and several groups started saying, yes, we are seeing excess heat, but the most important and unbelievable phenomenon at that time was the observation of tritium.
A mudslinging frenzy followed. The old guard of the scientific establishment, with their powerful influence in media and government, did everything possible to denounce Pons, Fleischmann, and their unprecedented work.
In conclusion, we have no evidence in our laboratory with any of our samples for fusion.
I'm very sorry that Professor Lewis has no information on the tritium levels. That is available, and is available in the correction list to the paper.
We know the foreground, we don't know the background. I would like to specifically...
The background, I beg your pardon, the background is available in the corrections to the paper.
That might be. I would like to specifically hear whether or not helium...
Could we go on to the question?
Peer-reviewed publications like Nature divisively shamed the discoverers with allegations of incompetence, touching off one of the greatest tragedies in the history of science.
I think that, broadly speaking, it's dead, and it'll remain dead for a long, long time.
This was a discovery perhaps as significant as the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk. But instead of embracing it, the governors of official science declared war on cold fusion. Was the promise of cold fusion too good to be true? Or was it trampled on by closed-minded, greedy power brokers whose special interests outweighed the public good?
Hydrogen and oxygen, the components of water, are two of the most reactive elements on Earth. Electrolysis, the process of extracting them from water as gas, has been known to science for nearly 200 years. This knowledge has enabled us to develop fuels, some of which are used to propel manned rockets into space. Though powerful, these chemical fuels don't hold a candle to the energy release of a nuclear reaction. The fire of this miracle was at the heart of what Pons and Fleischmann offered to the world with their groundbreaking cold fusion process.
When positively charged deuterons are attracted to the palladium cathode, they cram together, and there are millions and millions of them inside the cathode, getting closer and closer, and then they fuse, and they create energy in the form of helium. There's more energy in 1 cubic mile of seawater than in all the known oil reserves on Earth. I mean, you could drive your car 55 million miles on a gallon of heavy water. Maybe the end of pollution.
Hollywood's starry-eyed version of energy from water seems the stuff of fantasy. And while it is true that a definitive theory describing the effect has eluded scientists, former chief science writer for MIT, engineer Dr. Eugene Maloff, has assembled the evidence that takes the illusion out of cold fusion.
When I finished my book Fire from Ice in 1991, I concluded that the evidence for cold fusion was overwhelmingly compelling. Today, we can no longer say that the evidence is overwhelmingly compelling. It is now 100% certain.
Dismissed early on by carpers and critics, the field of cold fusion is very much alive. Energy-producing devices exist today that seem to defy the conventions of modern science.
We're getting nuclear energy output without the nuclear radiation byproducts.
If an atom were a huge athletic stadium, at its center would be a nucleus the size of a pea. In turn, an atom in the eye of this mouse would compare in size to the mouse, in the same way the mouse compares in size to the entire Earth. This comparison is characteristic of the monumental challenge faced by scientists worldwide in their effort to unravel the riddle of the cold fusion effect.
Well, our critics would say that the problem with cold fusion is that there is no theory to describe it. The problem is completely different. The problem is that there are far too many theories which purport to describe the same set of observations, and no more than one of these theories can be correct.
Fusion takes place when the nuclei of two atoms, usually hydrogen, collide and fuse together, releasing vast amounts of energy. Prevailing theories suggest that this can only happen at extreme temperatures like those found on the Sun or in a nuclear blast. Experimental reactor facilities like the Jet Plasma Hot Fusion site in England have attempted to replicate the fusion process of the Sun for decades.
Because current technology demands that more energy has to be put into a reaction than comes out, it hasn't been economically viable. However, Stanley Pons of the University of Utah and Martin Fleischmann of the University of Southampton claimed that they could create a fusion reaction at room temperature and make fusion energy a reality with the potential of making uncounted billions of energy dollars.
Scientists at hot fusion facilities like Princeton and MIT, seeking to replicate solar fusion, have received untold billions for the building of magnetically ringed tokamak reactors. Although a great deal has been learned through experimentation in this field, the process itself has never produced a single watt of excess power. At the time of the Pons and Fleischmann announcement, hot fusion research was in full swing. Several powerful university budgets were reliant upon research dollars siphoned off government coffers into the development of this technology.
Partly it was a very unfortunate time to make such an announcement for various political reasons, really. The situation in the United States, the situation with regard to the program in hot fusion. That was against it, but also, of course, was the fact that we were not ready to make such an announcement.
Cold fusion violates most of what I was taught in nuclear chemistry. once you see it happen in front of you in your own apparatus, it's pretty convincing that there's a reality, and that's what I base my continued interest on.
Since Pons and Fleischmann were both well aware of the pitfalls of premature publicity, why would they bypass the accepted conventions of the peer review system and announce their discovery through the media?
I was thinking, these guys are no fools. They know what they're doing. These are good scientists.
Prior to the 1989 announcement, Stephen E. Jones, a physics professor at nearby Brigham Young University, learned of Pons and Fleischmann's work through an informant at the DOE. In a flagrant example of shameless opportunism, Jones insisted on going public quickly with his comparatively much less clear results. Disparaging the excess heat claims of Fleischmann and Pons, Jones' announcement would have effectively prevented the two scientists from patenting their process, a process they had developed on their own over long years of research. On the advice of university attorneys, Pons and Fleischmann, feeling their backs to the wall, reluctantly delivered their work to public scrutiny. Though their discovery posed a very clear challenge to the energy industry, it was the scientific community, mostly physicists, which raised the specter of doubt and wrongdoing.
This experiment hasn't been reproduced by any national laboratory or any university yet without a good football team.
Cold fusion researcher Dr. Robert Bush.
Our reaction was not unlike that of other physicists who thought, on the one hand, gee, that'd be marvelous if they're doing it, and then on the other hand, my God, chemists doing it for probably pennies compared to what physicists have taken from the public coffer over the last 40 years, in the order of $40 billion to do hot fusion.
It was war from the outset. On April 14, 1989, Dr. Glenn Seaborg, a Nobel laureate with a distinguished record in conventional nuclear science, told then-President Bush, it is not due to nuclear fusion. Secretary of Energy Admiral James Watkins nevertheless enlisted many federally funded laboratories to investigate the cold fusion claim.
Admiral Watkins, who was at that time head of the Department of Energy, he had an edict. He said, this must be verified in 2 weeks. I'm going to put the whole of the DOE labs on it. So I had put the whole of my team on it. And of course it turned out that you couldn't get any results under 4 weeks, so he demanded the impossible, you see.
Massachusetts Institute of Technology was one of the testing facilities selected by the Department of Energy. MIT's hot fusion director, Professor Ronald R. Parker, fired the next salvo. On the front page of the Boston Herald, Parker accused Fleischmann and Pons of possible fraud and of engaging in scientific schlock. It was a well-timed directive to the American Physical Society to go on the attack against cold fusion. Princeton's Professor William Happer, a hot fusion veteran and advisor to Secretary Watkins, was quoted as saying, just by looking at Fleischmann and Pons on television, you could tell they were incompetent boobs.
Credibility for a scientist is the coin of the realm, and if you lose that coin, then you can't get grant funding. Your work becomes regarded as inferior, and you slip down notches in the eyes of your peers, and this is a real disaster.
For 5 years prior to their announcement, Fleischmann and Pons had used their own money to conduct experiments, passing a current through an electrochemical cell containing deuterium oxide, heavy water. One of the electrodes in the cell was made of the precious metal palladium. The electrical current separated out individual deuterium atoms and forced them to pack tightly into the palladium cathode. What happened next remains a mystery. Whether it was nuclear fusion or something else, the heat energy that came out of that little jar was thousands to millions of times what could be explained by any known chemical reaction.
To most classically trained physicists, the idea that low-level nuclear reactions could produce significant heat energy was unthinkable. The nuclei of atoms are all positively charged. They repel each other. They don't want to come together or fuse except at millions of degrees. And when they do, deadly radiation can be the result.
The U.S. Department of Energy, or DOE, convened a review panel in April of 1989. Dr. John Huizinga, an early cold fusion critic was assigned to a chair position, though his bias against cold fusion was well known. Huizenga claimed cold fusion was nonsense and advised authorities against a formal investigation. By mid-July, the DOE panel had completed their damning report.
Earlier in this century, a very distinguished chemist by the name of Irving Langmuir defined pathological science as the science of things that aren't true. And I have labeled my book, Cold Fusion, the scientific fiasco of the century, simply because there's no experimental evidence at this point that any nuclear reaction products have been formed. Therefore, the claim that cold fusion is a nuclear reaction process without a commensurate amount of nuclear reaction products is simply pathological science.
But 10 years of results from successful experiments support another conclusion.
There are thousands of papers that have already been published on cold fusion showing the evidence for the excess heat, the nuclear products, including helium, tritium, low-level neutrons. But at the same time, we have the establishment of physics and the establishment of science, for that matter, totally ignoring this and, in fact, mocking it.
Very quickly, I realized that cold fusion was going to be the world's best example of pathological science.
The criticism of pathological science is one which has quite frequently been leveled at unusual investigations, which admittedly sometimes are at fault. However, there is also the situation that people will criticize a field long after they should really have given up. And that is pathological criticism. They just get trapped in a situation. They have made a criticism. They have to maintain that criticism against all the evidence.
After decades of painstaking observation through his own homemade ground glass lenses, the Dutch janitor Antony Leeuwenhoek opened our eyes to the realm of microbiology in the year 1675. The world of science, however, continued to thumb its nose at the field for nearly 200 years, ridiculing the work of men like the great Louis Pasteur. Inventor Thomas Edison's vision of a world powered by direct current had its roots in his own pocketbook. His public criticisms of the work of rival Nikola Tesla almost cost civilization the miracle of AC current.
When the Wright brothers first flew in 1903, no papers covered it at all, because everybody was convinced, certainly the American press, that heavier-than-air flight was totally impossible. All the top scientists said this is nonsense. And editors wouldn't even bother to send journalists or photographers to interview the Wrights, or even to take pictures of them flying in full public view. And it wasn't for about 5 years that eventually they realized, my goodness, this is real. Heavier-than-air flight is possible. And I think a similar thing is going to happen with so-called cold fusion.
The scientific groundwork for cold fusion has been accomplished with great difficulty by underfunded scientists toiling over experiments in laboratories and basements around the world. Whether their efforts remain eclipsed by hot fusion and other cash cow programs or win the support of science and the public will be revealed over time.
Despite the nasty accusations made against cold fusion, accomplished scientists like Dr. Bob Bush and Dr. Edmund Storms of the Los Alamos Laboratory continued their leading-edge work, often producing extraordinary results.
We were seeing this marvelous effect of excess power and integrate over time excess heat in our own laboratory. So it wasn't as if we had to take somebody else's word for it. We had proved it. The conclusion was that the amount of palladium that you could fit on your thumb would be enough to produce a reactor that would supply the city of Los Angeles with all their power need.
Supporting evidence mounted throughout the 90s, yet revered experts like Huizenga, Happer, and Morrison clung to their original conclusions, flying the one prevailing negative DOE report as their standard.
There is something new coming up,
You know, professors who teach physics hate to change their courses. And generally, they don't appreciate monsters which crop up and which cannot be explained within the frame of the present knowledge.
Sociologists of science have said that if you get 4 big names in a field of science to stand up and say that something isn't so, that unfortunately all of the other people tend to fall into line kind of herd-like.
When science becomes a part of the belief structure of a society, you have the danger that people aren't going to go beyond the boundaries of that science. And every year we are discovering things that we didn't know last year. So science must always keep pace with discovery. And discovery is a real-time process. It is not about dogma.
Professor George Miley, director of the Fusion Studies Laboratory at the University of Illinois, was one of the few editors of a peer-reviewed journal to accept papers on cold fusion.
Let's take tritium as an example, which is work that Tom Claytor has done at Los Alamos. I asked him, have you convinced your management at Los Alamos that tritium is real? And he said, no, I haven't. The problem is that I only get a positive results 3 times out of 10. Now think about that. If it happens once, the inquisitive scientists should say, well, how did it happen? Let's find out how we can ultimately make it happen consistently.
At SRI International, Dr. Michael McCuber was one of the first scientists to replicate the cold fusion effect.
There is clearly evidence of anomalous excess heat which occur in these experiments. There are also, in similar experiments, evidence of an anomalous nuclear process. It's my suspicion, my bias, if you like, that the 2 anomalies are in fact connected.
In the free-for-all that followed the cold fusion announcement, hot fusion proponents drew the specious conclusion that cold fusion must work like hot fusion. If Pons and Fleischmann are alive, they contended, then their results must be faulty, since the neutron radiation from the fusion reaction would surely have killed them. They refused to consider that another form of the same process might be at work. In the years that have followed, the cold fusion process has repeatedly produced not only heat energy, but also nuclear byproducts such as tritium and the ash from a nuclear reaction, that all-important indicator of nuclear fusion, helium.
It's clearly not possible to produce helium from a chemical process. The only possibility that remains is that the helium is produced by a nuclear process. If the helium is produced by a nuclear process, then necessarily there will be an associated release of heat.
Basically, we were just trying to find out when we had excess heat, would there be helium present in the sample? And when there was no excess heat, we would find no helium present.
8 times when we had excess heat, we found helium. We ran controls 6 times when there was no excess heat, there was no helium.
Were the alleged negative findings of MIT and Caltech what soured science and the public to the cold fusion claim? Pons and Fleischmann had, after all, breached scientific etiquette by going public first, instead of through the accepted channels of the peer-reviewed system.
Data should be published in the most reputable of scientific journals. It should not be published first in the newspapers. It should not be disseminated through the popular media until, in fact, the information can be replicated.
Officials at the University of Utah were chastised for their haste in publicizing the discovery through the media.
There's a hypothesis, an idea. The idea is tested in the laboratory. It's written up in a journal. It undergoes peer review, which means experts in the field look at that information. They test its validity. They ask questions about its validity. Then it's published in the journal. Then, of course, the scientific community reads it. Then the scientific community tries to test, can they repeat this experiment?
Indeed, data affirming vital aspects of the discovery was published in reputable journals. But the presiding agenda of official science, the science of money and politics, drowned the truth in accusations of impropriety and outright fraud.
When it was first said by Fleischmann and Pons that cold fusion existed, this went all the way up to the president, and the president appointed a special committee of 22 excellent scientists to investigate it. And these scientists announced that they were going to U-turn to other laboratories to try and see what was happening. But every time they went to this laboratory, by some miracle, none of the cells worked at this time.
When the ERAB panel came through with Huizenga as the chairman on July the 6th, 1989, to visit, they were looking very lightly at the heat measurements and very strongly at the absence of neutrons in tritium. Once they saw no neutrons in tritium, they could use that to denounce the field and protect their budgets. And fascinatingly, many of the people on that panel, a couple of them I should say, came to me looking for research funds in this field, even though publicly they were speaking before Congress against having Congress put any money in it.
Early on, they were able to show that Pons and Fleischmann essentially made some serious mistakes in their interpretation of the nuclear physics. Eventually, I think because of this bad nuclear physics, the physicists threw out the good baby, which was the excess heat effect, along with the bad nuclear interpretation bathwater.
Also working in the field of cold fusion were esteemed scientists with personal knowledge of and confidence in the work of Pons and Fleischmann, scientists whose careers were likewise untarnished. Texas A&M professor John Bockris, regarded as a world-class electrochemist, led a research group at Texas A&M that produced essential evidence of the fusion phenomenon.
The first thing was this thing called tritium, which is a sub-form of hydrogen which should not exist except in extremely tiny quantities. And we found that by working these cells of Fleischmann and Pons that we could produce this tritium in great abundance. It was the first clear proof of the phenomenon.
Fortuitous or not, in the first experiment that we ran some 3 or 4 months after the initial announcement, we saw some evidence of excess heat.
And what we see in our laboratory is no evidence for any unusual nuclear or chemical reactions.
Having seen the effect with my own eyes, the claims from a few that this is impossible, inconsistent with all known laws of nuclear physics, these suggestions are in fact irrelevant.
At Texas A&M, the Bockris group came under attack. Science journalist Gary Taubes wrote an inflammatory article in Science magazine alleging that someone in the group had spiked the experiment with tritium. Although proven false, the accusation was enough to smear the work of the group and place Dr. Bockris in the line of fire.
Well, I was 69 years old at that time, and I took the attitude, suppose they fire me, right? It doesn't really matter. I'd had my career. The worst they could do would be to say, go. But finally the university revolted against this. They set up an inquiry.
Normally we'd say someone's innocent until proven guilty, and you'd be given the opportunity to have a trial rather than having an article written about what you've done wrong and identifies being guilty in the press rather than due process.
Finally they came out okay. I mean, they gave me another letter. I'd had the letter of complete exoneration, but I think the main part was that I had done work which was against the paradigm. You know, people said that they'd been to other universities and people had laughed at it and said, what the heck are you doing, trying to disprove the laws of nuclear physics? And of course that's exactly what we were doing and succeeding, you see.
With government labs like Los Alamos and universities around the world confirming the presence of excess heat in nuclear products, why the continued debate? Why do influential skeptics still insist that nothing unusual is going on? What would motivate such blatant distortion of the facts?
Today, scientists must live in a world run by finances, and not only to maintain the good life for themselves, but also to stock their labs. Getting more money has become more vital to scientists, or as vital to scientists as the research itself.
MIT's Hot Fusion Center, a federally funded facility, was among the loudest voices to disparage the work of Pons and Fleischmann. Ironically, upon re-examination of their results, disturbing inconsistencies appeared. MIT's raw data provided clear evidence of excess heat, but in MIT's official report, the graph was altered to reflect no excess heat. Engineer Dr. Eugene Maloff, chief science journalist at MIT, resigned in protest.
That's what I thought originally.
In the case of MIT, it was a disaster. These people, before even analyzing their calorimetry data, held a party for the death of cold fusion. And then they manipulated the data to make a positive result look negative. Their results don't prove cold fusion, but they certainly had a positive result.
It's complete nonsense, utterly ridiculous and without foundation. And any allegations along those lines, I believe, are made by people that don't understand how measurements are made.
An official investigation of the fraud was requested. MIT President Charles Vest, concurrently a member of the White House Advisory Panel for the Funding of Hot Fusion, conducted an investigation that was a sham. MIT's Hot Fusion Lab, the very facility which concocted the damning evidence that helped kill government funding for cold fusion in the U.S., went on to receive massive federal funding for its own hot fusion research. To this day, MIT's false no is cited as evidence against federal funding and the issuance of U.S. patents in the field. But MIT did not act alone.
I had a man, he was an employee of one of the national labs, and he said that on the plane over to Santa Fe, he had shown his boss some positive results, verifying phenomenon. And his boss had told him that if he presented those results, he'd be fired.
The boss I was working with at one point said, you should do that kind of experiment, that kind of experiment. And I said, well, look, I said, I'm more interested by doing something in cold fusion. I said, cold fusion, I mean, don't do that. He said, I said, why should I not do that? He said, because it doesn't work. I said, yes, it works. I've done experiments. I know people who have done experiments. I know Pons and Fleischmann. And look, he said, if you decide to do it, you cannot work with me anymore because I don't want my name to be attached to your name.
With congressional funding dead, Fleischmann and Pons moved to France to carry on their research.
By 1992, we had video recordings of intense energy release. By the summer of 1994, we had demonstrated sustained energy release. If you say you wish to make this into a device by about the year 2000, if the resources had been available, we would have got to that particular point, probably before the year 2000. But this did not happen.
Cold fusion pioneers carried on despite continued attacks on their reputations and careers. By 1999, 8 international conferences had been held with several thousand technical papers published in peer-reviewed journals worldwide. In the U.S., the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI, a private consortium including dozens of utility companies, spent over $10 million to investigate cold fusion claims. In its final report, EPRI concluded, quote, definite evidence of nuclear reactions were detected. But with the federal funding out of the picture, proponents of cold fusion had to look elsewhere to continue their revolutionary science.
In the mid-90s, the government of Japan funded a cold fusion program called New Hydrogen Energy. Though short-lived, it inspired many Japanese scientists to break new ground in this area. The governments of Italy and France funded research, and many private startups in the U.S., convinced of the commercial potential of the process, began securing related patents, while carefully avoiding the stigma of being tagged cold fusion. Over the last decade, independent inventors have developed cold fusion devices that have at first glance seemed promising, only to fall short when examined by qualified scientists. But what if a cold fusion device did exist that produced excess heat consistently before trained independent eyes? Clean Energy Technologies of Sarasota, Florida, has already brought scientific demonstration cells to market. Using ordinary water and tiny metal-coated beads, they claim their Patterson power cell has produced up to 1,000 times the input power. Motorola sponsored a test of this cell wherein 20 watts of heat were produced for 11 hours. This heat continued even after the tiny input electricity was turned off.
They start producing excess heat almost right away, By the time we do the measurements, there's already excess heat.
While carefully avoiding being called cold fusion, Dr. Randall Mills of Blacklight Power in New Jersey has attracted substantial funding, creating a company positioned to be a leading manufacturer in the new energy age.
Some of our better experiments with the electrolytic cell have generated as much as 1,000% excess heat. For example, if we put 1 watt into the cell, we will get 10 watts out.
This vessel is sitting here making, as we watch, helium-4, and the temperature is 215 degrees centigrade. This is the key. You change this just a little bit, and it doesn't work at all. Now, this is a very novel concept that you can have a nuclear fusion occur at 215 centigrade and 1 atmosphere pressure.
The temperature record quite clearly indicates in these experiments, as it does in Les Case's experiment, that there is an unexplained source of heat, and the magnitude of that source of heat is approximately the right value to account for the observed helium.
So inside this vessel now for 6-7 weeks, we have had deuterium fusing to helium-4 and giving this excess temperature of about 35 degrees centigrade, which is big, a really big effect.
The technology of catalytic fusion developed by Dr. Les Case is one of the most extraordinary developments we have in the cold fusion field. He has excess heat, massive excess heat, and also helium-4 production, the very nuclear ash that the opponents of cold fusion demanded in the early days. It appears as though he is very close to having a self-sustaining device that will keep hot by itself, generate steam, hot water, perhaps electricity, before much longer.
Alchemy, the idea that lead can be turned into gold, was always considered a medieval myth. While modern science has proved that transmutation of elements is possible, the process is far too costly to be practical. Yet as early as 1992, scientists experimenting with cold fusion observed in their spent cells small amounts of metals like copper, silver, and zinc that simply shouldn't be there.
Kevin Wolf, a nuclear physicist incidentally, made many measurements of tritium. Then he got some even more astonishing results as early as '92, which were these transmutational results, the metal forming another metal inside the electrode, you see, which was super anti-paradigm. There's that dreadful word alchemy, which we mustn't use, but it was a form of that in a way, that it was creating new metals, you see.
Tadayoshi Omori and Tadahiko Mizuno of the Hokkaido University in Japan produced volumes of data documenting the production of metals from iron to platinum. Along with these, consistently, came the production of excess heat energy. The potential environmental benefits of this technology are awesome. Companies like SETI, Trenergy, and the Cincinnati Group are developing ways to solve the world's radioactive waste problem, changing radioactive materials into some other form of harmless metal. In 1999, developments in this area prompted the DOE to award a research grant to Professor George Miley of the University of Illinois. However, within days of the grant announcement, the ever-vigilant critics of cold fusion science attacked Miley's work and killed his funding. On the secret panel set up to repeal the grant was the ardent enemy of cold fusion science himself, Dr. John Huizinga.
Nuclear energy was once a laboratory curiosity. So let's assume that these devices can be developed. The future is then almost unlimited. It could be the end of the fossil fuel age, the end of oil and coal, and the end, incidentally, of many of our worries about global pollution and global warming.
While the environmental challenges faced by the U.S. often make front-page news, the pollution problems encountered by third world nations and countries relying exclusively on fossil fuels fare much worse.
2/3 of the cities has problem in pollution.
And 1/3 of the land of my country is damaged by the acid rain. The 80% of the power energy source is from coal. We have 1.2 billion population, and we anticipate it will be 1/2 or more billion in the middle of next century. We consume 1 ton of the coal per capita. So if we increase our power consumption by a factor of 3, then we will burn about 5 billion tons of coal in the middle of next century.
What is the ultimate potential of cold fusion technology? It has been estimated that 250 miles of coal cars could be replaced with as little as 1 pickup truck full of heavy water. The daily waste from a 1,000 megawatt cold fusion plant would be approximately 150 grams of helium, which is harmless compared to some 30,000 tons of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other wastes produced by a comparable fossil fuel plant.
What I like about cold fusion is it is different from thermal power, hydroelectric power, or nuclear fission power because it is potentially small and the investments required are much smaller, and hopefully it can be mass produced by industry. And this completely changes the whole concept of power generation, distribution, consumption.
I think the electric power grid will absolutely wither away. I think automobiles, trucks, trains, planes, all forms of transportation will use this new powerful energy source. The writing is on the wall. The fossil fuel age is about to end.
Every day, the burning of fossil fuels contributes to the destruction of our environment, while the breakthrough discovery of a totally clean, virtually unlimited energy source languishes in obscurity.
It's history in the making, what we're living here. I mean, I couldn't dream of a situation like that.
Despite a decade of experimentation and a body of indisputable evidence, the gatekeepers of official science continue to deprive us of a technology we so desperately need to be proper stewards of our world.
Without some morals or something to believe in on this planet, be it God or science or whatever you truly believe in, and what do you have? What do you have? What do you have? What reason do you have to survive? What reason do you have to go on? We did nothing wrong. We made no mistakes in our observations. We made no mistakes.
In a world where corruption, greed, and political maneuvering often win out over the virtues of the human spirit, we believed, perhaps naively, that an exception might exist in the experimental sciences. The history of science is littered with individual incidents of fraud, patent stealing, and flagrant misrepresentation, but here we found a contemporary conspiracy that overshadows most of what we've discovered in the Phenomenon Archives. Revealed in upcoming episodes of this program are the contents of a recently unearthed repository classified by the secret government, the Phenomenon Archives. Many of us would like to believe that the achievement of greatness is rewarded, if not monetarily, then certainly through the even eyes of history. In the next 60 minutes, you may be shocked to discover that at least one man whose accomplishments touch each of our lives on a daily basis has been virtually forgotten. At the head of the 20th century, Nikola Tesla, a Serbian immigrant and inventor whose name is nearly forgotten, catapulted our civilization into the new age. The use of alternating current, radio, fluorescent lighting, remote control, and robotics, a total of 700 patents, are all attributable to this one man.
On Thursday, January the 7th, 1943, at approximately 10:30 p.m., with the world engulfed in a struggle against the dark forces of the Nazi war machine, Nikola Tesla breathes his last, dying alone in a small room at the Hotel New Yorker. Outside, the city is alive with his legacy, glistening with the electricity from Tesla's fully realized vision of a world powered by alternating current.
He was incredibly aware of the consequences of his scientific inventions and their impact on the total development of mankind.
Tesla is buried in relative obscurity, a fallen giant of invention whose discoveries remain the foundation for some of civilization's most important scientific advancements.
He is one of the greatest geniuses of the 19th century.
Edison was one level of science, but Tesla was many levels higher.
He was a lonely character, researching independently, outside mainstream science. He must have appeared to the so-called normal world like a complete eccentric.
He gave our country a tremendous package of technology, applications and wonders, and our lives, all our lives are collectively much better because of his work.
Why has this great man been so neglected by his fellow scientists and the public? Perhaps the answers lie more in the works never realized by Tesla than in his publicly acknowledged achievements.
Legend has it that Nikola Tesla was born at the stroke of midnight in 1856 in the midst of a dazzling electrical storm. As a young man, his greatest aspiration was to harness the power of Niagara Falls. He achieved that dream, and in so doing, popularized alternating current. Now, already a half-century after his death, a mystery surrounds Tesla. His contributions, which were great and many, have descended into obscurity. Why? Nikola Tesla was a humanitarian, a U.S. patriot, and yes, an unbridled genius. Though he has most often been personified as the quintessential mad scientist, perhaps his only real misdeed was being born ahead of his time.
Tesla, a Serb, grew up in a small village in Croatia, the son of a strict clergyman and a brilliant, inventive mother. With a photographic memory and the ability to learn 6 languages by the age of 18, Tesla soon assumes his path in life as a gifted inventor. He has an uncanny ability to visualize his inventions, to assemble, test, and disassemble them to exacting dimensions, all in his mind, either while awake or in his dreams.
From the time he was an early child, Tesla had the capability to visualize something so intensely and so vividly that he simply couldn't tell the difference between that and a real object.
In 1884, Nikola Tesla emigrates to the United States. Virtually penniless, he presents himself to Thomas Edison and is hired immediately.
Okay, Tesla, consider yourself introduced.
But when Tesla describes to Edison his intricate plans for alternating current and a polyphase motor system far more efficient than Edison's direct current system, Edison recognizes Tesla as a potentially dangerous competitor.
You know, Edison just didn't want anybody to get ahead of him, even if he had a better system. And this is the way it is when you get aggressive people working. They will destroy each other.
A prize is offered to anyone who can harness and transmit energy from Niagara Falls to Buffalo, New York. Edison does everything in his power to discredit alternating current and Tesla.
Alternating current is a danger to human life.
Start the generator.
You have just seen alternating current in action.
Despite Edison's opposition, Tesla's AC polyphase system is adopted. And in May of 1888, George Westinghouse hears about this remarkable inventor and buys the alternating current patents. By 1897, both Tesla and alternating current become a household name throughout the world.
He realized completely what would happen with the implementation of alternating current and electrification of the whole planet. That it would bring tremendous change in human life, in information in general, even in the mental state of human beings.
Despite his new notoriety, Tesla is a pure inventor, a great dreamer, and does not actively pursue the commercial exploitation of his ideas. His many remarkable breakthroughs in high-frequency electricity, including radar, radio, neon, and fluorescent lamps, are often attributed to others. For instance, Tesla's invention of shadowgraphs, a system for taking X-ray photographs, predates the work of Wilhelm Röntgen. Tesla's fertile imagination enkindles theories for the internet and television years ahead of their time. Though these visionary leaps are ultimately proven and manifest, Tesla's tendency toward exaggeration and the manner in which he announces his ideas to the press cause the inventor a good deal of public criticism.
We must be able to transmit scenes from other places over long distances. Pictures, the news, energy, and why not matter too? Now we must liberate thought. We must set it free of limitations that space and time impose on it, and yet keep its principal characteristics, now and in future centuries.
A flamboyant and mysterious man, always too eager to share his ideas with the world, Tesla demonstrates his laboratory experiments to such friends and luminaries as Mark Twain.
The man was socially capable of hobnobbing with the most elite people in the world at the time, Mark Twain, Westinghouse, J.P. Morgan, and from his acquaintances was able to finance some of the most spectacular experiments in history.
As a publicity stunt, Tesla would sit in his laboratory while massive bolts of electricity danced about him. Without the use of wires, these airborne streamers would freely illuminate the lamps held in Tesla's hand.
And Tesla was the first person to really show how to transmit wireless energy through the air to ignite electrical bulbs or electrical tubes. They were fluorescent tubes, which he had in the room. These tubes would respond to different frequencies. So if he produced one frequency, one group of bulbs would light, and if he produced another frequency, another group of bulbs would light.
In 1898, while perfecting his patents for the invention of wireless radio transmission, Tesla's laboratory mysteriously burns to the ground. This fire destroys thousands of hours of work, setting the inventor back years and costing him personally over $1 million. Tesla is horrified by the extent of the damage, but his is a resilient spirit. For while the hardware lay in cinders, Tesla's remarkable mental abilities enabled him to begin the process of recreating his work. In 1899, Tesla moves to Colorado Springs to experiment with terrestrial and atmospheric waves. Out on the prairie, he pursues his passion for discovering sources of free energy, both above and below the surface of the Earth. While investigating a phenomenon known as the Schumann cavity, he develops his theories for tapping limitless sources of power that all people of the world may share.
Surrounding the Earth, there's a cavity that resonates at about 8 cycles per second. And this cavity exists between the Earth we're standing on now and the bottom of the ionosphere, about a 60-kilometer gap. And this three-dimensional resonant cavity, in that cavity, you can transmit power, electromagnetic energy, at 8 hertz with almost no attenuation. The Schumann cavity is pumped or fueled at this time with megawatts of power from the lightning strokes that are occurring many times a second on a worldwide basis.
It's rather like a child who's playing with a tetherball. Tesla was so creative, he envisioned using his power transmitter to spank the ball, put a great big ball of electricity, if by analogy, a pulse of electricity, in the ionosphere, and it would very weakly distribute itself all the way around the world. And when it came around the other side, just at the right moment, he would spank it again with another pulse of electricity. And he'd keep doing this until the accumulated energy was so great that it would be a resource to be pulled back out of the sky by a proper antenna.
Tesla's idea was to be able to provide power equally to all people on Earth. At this time, there are 2 to 3 billion people on this planet that can't go home at night and turn on the lights. We can. The people that can are living in poverty. Tesla saw that there was a division between the have and the have-nots, and he was determined to make electrical power equally available to all people on this planet as a gift.
Tesla develops the technology at Colorado Springs to produce astonishingly high voltages and currents. When the switch is thrown, ghostly sparks dance inside the lab, while on the copper ball atop the antenna, thick blue lightning crackles upward over 100 feet into the sky. Thunderclaps are heard over 15 miles away. It is one of the great inventor's crowning achievements, man-made lightning.
At Colorado Springs, he had a 56 kilovolt ampere Westinghouse transformer that George Westinghouse gave to him, and it had various taps on it up to 55,000 volts. And through the amplification of this transformer into his magnifying transmitter, he's able to actually blowing up the Colorado Springs, some of the generators in the power at Colorado Springs plant at a distance of about 25 miles away.
Originally, it was thought that he generated or used so much power from the utility company that it burned out a couple of their generators. Since then, there's been some conjecture that actually he was picking up more energy from the surrounding air at that high altitude, and it was feeding back into the generator, and you cannot feed electrical energy back into a generator, and that's what blew him out. And they wouldn't sell him any more power until he and his assistant went down and repaired the generators.
Tesla determines that waves of energy in the Earth can be used to transmit power to any point on the globe. In laboratory tests, he successfully demonstrates the illumination of wireless lamps many miles from the laboratory. But his experiments also produce more ominous possibilities.
Alpha waves in the human brain are between 6 and 8 hertz. The wave frequency of the Schumann cavity resonates between 6 and 8 hertz. All biological systems operate in the same frequency range. The human brain's alpha waves function in this range, and the electrical resonance of the Earth is between 6 and 8 hertz. Thus, our entire biological system, the brain and the Earth itself, work on the same frequencies. If we can control that resonant system electronically, we could directly control the entire mental system of humankind.
Tesla, aware of the awesome power this aspect of his discovery might unleash, decides to keep it under wraps. With the success of the Colorado experiments, Tesla moves back to New York City. After courting several financial backers, he is introduced to J.P. Morgan, the infamous banker and international financier. Morgan is convinced by Tesla's promise that he can, quote, build a world broadcasting system that will earn millions. Inspired by the earlier works of genius attributed to Tesla, the business-savvy Morgan invests $150,000. Though he must concede 51% ownership in his radio patents to the fabulously wealthy industrialist, Tesla nevertheless proceeds with his construction of the legendary Wardenclyffe Tower in 1900.
Wardenclyffe Laboratories were built by Tesla to try to prove his dream, his radio transmission of power. First it started off, he told his backers it would be just voice communication, but his real dream was power.
Soon thereafter, with Wardenclyffe in the midst of construction, Tesla receives a report that Guglielmo Marconi has successfully completed a trans-ocean radio transmission. Morgan threatens to pull out. Rather than admit defeat, Tesla expands on his original idea for Wardenclyffe, transforming it into the pilot project for his long-envisioned global power and communications system. Tesla promises Morgan that he can erect a system of towers that will pull down energy from the ionosphere, making it possible to transmit electricity throughout the world without wires. In short, free energy for everyone.
Tesla was called a nut because Tesla also said that he could generate without any fuel, without any solar energy, without any wind power, he could generate electrical power, and he did do that. And that was something that the fuel companies didn't want to have happen. He was also able to broadcast electrical power through the air without any wires. And that project was stopped by J.P. Morgan when the commercial consequences became obvious.
Seeing no way to make a profit from Tesla's free energy device and convinced Marconi would monopolize radio, Morgan backs off. Ironically, over 40 years later, the Supreme Court of the United States determines that Marconi copied his radio technology from patents already held by Tesla, and that it was Tesla who actually discovered wireless transmission. Some believe that the Wardenclyffe fiasco was about more than just money. They say Tesla himself scuttled the plant out of fear that in the wrong hands, the potential power generated by Wardenclyffe could bring lasting harm to the people and the planet.
Although Morgan didn't finance the Wardenclyffe Tower at the end, it seems to me the project was not stopped because of money. Tesla stopped it when he realized his ideas might be co-opted and implemented solely for military purposes. That's probably the wisest decision a scientist can make.
And Tesla reveals for the first time in an article published in the New York Times that Wardenclyffe could also be used as a weapon to take down airplanes.
He managed to stop the catastrophe that would be attributed to him, because being able to free and target down 2 billion volts from the ionosphere is sufficient to burn any city on the planet. The effect is stronger than the atomic bomb.
Did Tesla discover the ultimate means of destruction? The answer is still unresolved. By 1915, it is rumored that Tesla and Thomas Edison are each to receive the Nobel Prize, but these reports prove false. 2 years later, Tesla is awarded the Edison Medal by the American Institute of Electrical Engineers. But any credibility this might afford him is undone by Tesla's extravagant boasts that Wardenclyffe can be used to modify the weather.
They tore the tower down during the war because the military thought that was there for spy purposes. It took at least 3 or 4 charges of dynamite. It was so well built, they almost couldn't demolish it. But before it was completely dismembered, it was experimented with by someone who wanted to project scalar waves. All the birds, seagulls, and everything else left the area. There wasn't one within 20 miles. And the fishermen normally go out there complain because there were no fish that they could catch within a radius of 10 or 15 miles while that station was operating. That's why you can get a manifestation of some animals acting strangely a day or hours before an earthquake.
With his beloved tower in ruins, Tesla retreats into his laboratory and begins far more complex and dangerous experiments.
On July 11, 1934, the New York Times reports that Nikola Tesla has developed a death ray, a particle beam weapon that can destroy 10,000 planes at a distance of 250 miles. Tesla claims that a plant for producing this device could be constructed in 3 months at a cost of $2 million. Aside from the devastating offensive capabilities, Tesla believes that if he can successfully build 12 of these towers, his is a weapon to end all wars.
Tesla's famous death ray was a device which probably is very widely misunderstood and may have been one of the reasons why he didn't receive some of the respect by the scientific community that he may have well deserved. I think today a lot of people think of a death ray as a phaser or some esoteric type device you might see on a science fiction movie.
It's a plane! It's Superman!
Tesla's claims terrify the public, but fascinate Hollywood. He is parodied in Superman cartoons as a mad scientist terrorizing New York with an electrothanasia death ray and an army of remote-controlled robots.
Tesla's death ray was actually a particle beam weapon. A particle beam weapon which he had developed in the 30s. It was based on the principle of electrostatic acceleration of minute particles of charge, similar to work being done by the Department of Defense. The basic concept is that you take a particle, a micro projectile it's called, and through the use of high voltage, you accelerate it to great velocities. The velocity being very high, the particle doesn't have to be very big to do a lot of damage. If you get a stream of these things being accelerated and projected, you will do substantial damage. You'd be able to knock down a missile in space, for instance.
With only 12 such plants strategically placed around the United States, Tesla claims his Teleforce can be used to keep the United States safe from all foes. With the world on the verge of World War II, the United States government takes an active interest in the Tesla death ray.
Because he was a patriot, he offered this system to the United States government. The United States government developed and worked and engineered this particle beam weapon beginning in the 40s. We don't know what the extent of the research was or where it went from there, but we do have declassified documents released under the Freedom of Information Act that demonstrate the U.S. government's extreme interest in Tesla's particle beam weapon.
The New York Times states that Tesla's death ray, which can send concentrated beams of particles through the air and cause armies of millions to drop in their tracks, is the most important of Tesla's inventions. But in an unprecedented decision, Tesla makes the exploitation of his invention by any single government impossible. He distributes the plans in proprietary segments, like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle.
He gave it to the English, Canadian, American, and Russian governments so that they had to sit down together to collaborate if they wanted to realize the whole invention. He realized that people are not conscious enough to handle this information. That's why Tesla put these governments into mutual dependability.
There's some evidence that Tesla had given the plans to the Russians who were on our side at that time. In the 1970s, Aviation Week showed an article on the Russian particle beam weapon, and Tesla's particle beam weapon didn't surface until about 10 years later when Andrei Puharich brought it out, and the schematics exactly matched the Russian particle beam weapon.
Head of U.S. Air Force Intelligence, Major General George Keegan, describes the Soviet system.
And what comes out of the end of this little magnetic tube are pulsed proton beams, 100 billion electron volts, each at energy levels at 10 to the 10 joules. That's just simply more energy than any man has ever conceived of in the United States. And then you have to bend that beam, and you have to burn it through the atmosphere, and you have to find an object to aim it at.
Nikola Tesla sent a proposal to Russian scientists and engineers on May 16, 1935, concerning high voltage and the acceleration of charged particles. He received a list of follow-up questions from them in November of that year.
Military scholars contend that the Soviets achieved a 100% Star Wars defense by 1968.
We had learned through very sensitive sources that the Soviets in 1977 would test in space the most powerful laser in history, 10 times more powerful than any laser we have under development in the U.S. Finally, when I became Chief of Air Force Intelligence, my first act of office was to put out an order stating that this device and this development would be the #1 priority in Air Force Intelligence. So we set up a meeting with 40 or 50 of the top nuclear scientists in the free world, from Edward Teller on down. And these scientists, for 6 years, under a $60 million secret project called Project Seesaw, had been trying to develop an electron beam to shoot down ICBMs, and they'd failed. And now, both in the White House and in the Department of Defense, there is an embarrassed silence as the technicians and scientists on both staffs, now having examined the massive body of research we did in the Air Force, suddenly realize that they may have misinformed the American public.
Was President Ronald Reagan merely attempting to catch up with the Soviets in his development of the Strategic Defense Initiative?
All we can do is make sure that technology becomes the ally and protector of peace, that we build better shields rather than sharper and more deadly swords. In so doing, maybe we can help to bring an end to the brutal legacy of modern warfare.
As a result of America's delays in weaponry development, Tesla's discoveries are only now, nearly 100 years later, being adapted for both offensive and defensive purposes. The latest development? Space-based particle beam satellites.
The paper which showed the technology to make the anti-war machine was eventually published in the proceedings of the International Tesla Society. So it's in the public domain now, how to do it. And what is uncanny is that when one knows today's Star Wars program and the beam weaponry that has been selected, it is almost identical to what was proposed by Tesla.
At the time that I came across the documents, I took it to experts in the aerospace field and asked them to look at his technique for generating high voltages. At the time, the aerospace firm I was working with was working on particle beam technology, and they had a study group that was working on proposals to give to the government on directed energy weapons. I gave that proposal to the Advanced Projects Research Team and asked them to consider it. The only word that I ever got back from them was that they said it was interesting, and they would say no more.
Tesla certainly spoke of a very large series of very powerful weapons. I think that's a reasonable thing, and let's approach it this way. Certainly I'm on record as saying the weapons exist and that several nations have weaponized them. We know that the Russians very early on were interested in things like free energy right out of the vacuum, and they were interested in weapons.
What became of Tesla's weapon? It's never been heard from since. It may be something that's in a closet somewhere. It may be something that's used. It may be in orbit. We don't know.
There is no question today that the Soviet Union has these weapons. And if what I put together is correct, and I'm absolutely convinced it is, 3 other nations of the world also developed those weapons and resoundingly checked the Soviet Union. The other 3 are friendly to the United States, not hostile. And I think that played one great part in the fall of the Soviet Empire. 3 other nations today are indeed working on what I call the Tesla weapons, or really scalar electromagnetic weapons. And these nations are not really friendly to the U.S. at all. So it's a much more dangerous world that has emerged.
In an article published November 3rd, 1998, Bill Gertz of the Washington Times writes, "The Chinese army is building laser weapons and already possesses particle beam weapons capable of damaging sensors on space-based reconnaissance and intelligence systems. If the People's Liberation Army has beam weapons, what about the U.S. military? Under promise of anonymity, this Navy SEAL spoke about current capabilities.
We do have particle beam weapons. I've used them. We did underwater tests off the coast of California. The capabilities are awesome. You can knock down a satellite, a ship, a plane, anything.
In the global race for new technology, it appears that Tesla's death beam is not the only secret invention that supposedly disappears when he dies. On July 4th, 1976, the celebration of America's bicentennial, a strange new signal is monitored on ham radio frequencies. This high-pitched chattering is dubbed the woodpecker signal by the Central Intelligence Agency. They have no idea what it is, but they are able to triangulate its source to a Soviet transmitter in Latvia.
The Soviets had experimented with creating artificial aurora. Not sure what their objective was, but I think it was probably designed to prove that you could project very low frequency energy over the horizon, over great distances, and cause certain effects.
You can induce virtually any effect that a chemical can cause in a living system with an external, primarily extremely low frequency magnetic field. My personal feeling is that primarily I think it was designed to communicate with their submarines.
On July 13, 1977, at 9:19 p.m., the woodpecker signal abruptly stops. A strange corona forms around Edison Electric power generators servicing New York City, and the entire city is suddenly plunged into darkness, creating chaos and confusion. The blackout is similar in its effects to Tesla's Colorado Springs experiment that overloads and sets ablaze the local electrical power plant.
Things start to brown out. We started seeing very strange things happen to New Yorkers who went berserk. It was literally absolutely dangerous to be there in New York City. And was a headache for police and who knows, all the security people around.
Was it Tesla's secret that electricity could alter the mental state of human beings? If so, was that secret delivered into the wrong hands? And who is responsible for the Tesla-inspired program known as HARP, a government project some experts believe is the first stage of an entirely new phase in weapons technology?
War or peace? Which does science serve best? Tesla described himself not as an inventor, but as a discoverer. But with discovery comes responsibility. Tesla knew this when he developed HARP technology, and many think that his fear of what might happen if HARP fell into the wrong hands motivated him to keep his discovery under wraps.
HARP exists because Tesla theorized back in the 30s that he would be able to stimulate the magnetic field of the Earth in such a way that he would actually be able to create a shield around the city. HARP is basically a design experiment in terms of atmospheric physics where a large array of antennas, it's not just one antenna, it's a very large array, it covers several acres, are broadcasting into the ionosphere of the planet a very, very complex series of waveforms. And these waveforms are designed to specifically couple in with the ionosphere, which is a resonant cavity.
This concept involves heating up the ionosphere in a manner similar to a giant microwave oven.
That a small input, like a pulse of a certain number of watts in, can create a large output, because whether accidentally or intentionally, it's possible to tap into this sea of energy around us. It surrounds us and goes through our bodies and is everywhere throughout space.
HARP's original designer conceives it as a shield for missile defense that can fry the circuitry of incoming bombs.
HARP was designed for a number of applications. It really was not set up as a weapon. If you read the patents, I was thinking of ways to use it defensively.
He also claims that by superheating portions of the upper atmosphere, HAARP can affect global weather patterns, a concept Tesla was ridiculed for nearly a century earlier.
One of the real dangers of HAARP is that we concentrate with HAARP in one very small area of the ionosphere. We create a lightning rod effect. We create a lightning rod that can distort the magnetosphere of the planet, which is the magnetic shield of the planet.
Not only are you sending energy into the ionosphere, but you're providing a path for energy to come back down out of the ionosphere. The electrons and energy will come from all over the ionosphere to that one point, and it will strike the ground in a bolt that is 100 times greater than any lightning bolt imaginable. Kind of like 3 or 4 Mount St. Helens volcanoes going off each second.
The true power of HAARP technology is not yet known, and there is no civilian monitoring agency. The possibility that HAARP may be capable of enormous planetary disruptions, including weather changes, global warming, or even slowing the Earth's orbit by shifting the shape of the ionosphere, may tell us why Tesla suppressed the blueprints for this invention.
He stopped his power shield defense project in 1905 because he realized that such a resonant system of 5 towers around the globe could cause a tremendous destruction of humankind.
Not long after, Tesla's money runs out. His main supporters either die or sever relations. As his anonymity increases, he continues with even more esoteric research.
He was very much concerned with being able to utilize the phenomenon of resonance to do certain things, not the least of which was to destroy certain materials. And that was evidenced later on by that experiment he did on Wall Street, where the new building, steel building, was going up, and he tried out one of his resonators, nothing more than a mechanical vibrator. It was battery operated, and set up a resonance in the steel beams to the point where it kept building up, like pushing a kid on a swing, you know, keep pushing, and a little push will take it a lot further every time. And he almost brought the building down, scared the people who were working on it. They thought they were having an earthquake. And they went down and called the police and everything else. Tesla got a little bit scared and picked up his equipment, put it in his pocket, and went home.
He had one other unfortunate incident, which today we would laugh at, but was very serious at the time. He picked up radio signals from space. You know, we know today, of course, that planets radiate RF noise and so forth. But when he announced this, it just caused a sensation, and all the scientists said immediately, "What a kook, you know, what a idiot."
There were rumors you went to Colorado Springs in order to contact Mars. Is that true?
I never intended to. However, I recorded certain electrical impulses of unknown origin, and these were repeated at constantly timed intervals. It's possible they were a kind of signal from space.
And did you in turn send them a message?
Ask the Martians that question.
Mr. Tesla,
That's all today. No more questions, please.
They got to thinking, I'm sure, well, he's talking crazy now. He's feeding pigeons in the park, and he's got this crazy idea of transmitting signals to Mars. And
Tesla is so advanced in his thinking, so sensitive and eccentric, that few of his colleagues understand his work. He is perceived as snobbish and overconfident.
He was ostracized, I think, primarily because of his difference and because of his radical statements and because of his pronouncements of great systems. They didn't have the foggiest notion of what he was talking about.
Nikola Tesla saw many of his inventions scrutinized, then adopted by the military. However, it becomes apparent that as a citizen of the planet, Tesla ultimately serves a much higher authority.
He met Swami Vivekananda in New York City in the late 1890s. Swami Vivekananda was probably the first yogi to come to this country with Eastern philosophy and present it to the West. It was at Swami Vivekananda's lectures that Tesla picked up the Sanskrit terminology, prana, akasha, and the concepts of the ether that led him to determine, or actually led him to a point where he could describe succinctly the physics of the universe, the physics of matter creation in this dimension.
In many of his letters, he wrote that if he were to choose a religion, it would be Buddhism. All his stories about his journeys in other worlds, about dreams, about machines that operated in his imagination, were manifestations similar to the experience of the shamans. It was known that his solutions came during a dream.
Tesla's view of the universe, his cosmology, if I might call it that, is based on viewing life from a spiritual point of view. And it was in the science of the ancient works of the Vedas where he found the spiritual terminology to describe what he saw manifest in the physical world.
What leads Tesla to this spiritual awakening may never be known. But it is not uncommon among those forward-thinking patrons of discovery, people like Robert Oppenheimer, father of the nuclear bomb, or Albert Einstein, that in the end they recognized the singular perfection of the interconnected and life-imbuing system of our planet.
He was trying to understand what the basics of energy and resonance were. What is the nature of the energy that's in the cosmos? What's the basic essence of the energies that come through nothingness to give us something? I think those were the questions that Tesla was intrigued with.
When Tesla dies at the age of 87, his legacy of over 700 important patents slip into obscurity, forgotten by nearly everyone except the U.S. government. Tesla's possessions are sequestered in a government warehouse for 10 years following his death. Official reports confirm that the collection was microfilmed during this period. When contacted, however, no government agency revealed any information regarding these microfilms. After a decade, the government officially denies the existence of any secret weapons technologies included among the Tesla papers. Rumors nevertheless persist to this day. Whatever may have befallen Tesla's undeveloped discoveries, the inventions that remain contribute daily to our science, our medicine, and our environment. Perhaps this is what Tesla ultimately envisioned. Perhaps the missing secrets of Nikola Tesla are right where they belong.
Tesla disagreed with scientists about some basic concepts of relativity theory and quantum mechanical theory, and he fell out of favor with the established scientists of the day.
Tesla was very knowledgeable about quantum mechanics and Einstein's theory of relativity. Both were developed during his lifetime. And he suspected that sooner or later, quantum mechanics and relativity theorists would enter into a crisis. And that's why he used to say, "The present time is theirs, but the future is mine."
Sir Albert Einstein also said that once there's a bunch of little theories all over the world, that's a prelude to a major breakthrough in science and physics.
I think that science today needs to take a new look at some of the theories of Tesla, because there is more to the universe than what we are looking at and what we are observing with our scientific instruments. We've reached a point in our conscious evolution of the species. We have the ability at our fingertips now to engineer and to manipulate space-time and gravity. We're on the threshold of a new technology.
Nikola Tesla was the gatekeeper of lightning. Some of his ideas earned him a reputation as a fruitcake. Some permanently rocked the world of science. Still others changed our planet and our lives. The next time you plug in your cable TV, remember the man who made it all possible. You might also imagine a world with free, unlimited energy, and a world without wires, because that's what we lost when we lost the lightning of Nikola Tesla. I'm Dean Stockwell, and these are the Phenomenon Archives.